Welcome to EQUUS Farm Calls, where we take horse owners along with us to discuss important topics on equine health and care with industry experts. Today we're talking to Dr. Tom Chambers about equine influenza. The EQUUS Farm Calls podcast is brought to you in 2022 by Farnam. A shiny coat and luxurious mane and tail are a reflection of overall health that starts with proper nutrition. Revolutionize your grooming routine from the inside out with Farnam Laser Sheen Skin and Coat Supplement. This exclusive formula combines a proper balance of omega-3 and 6 fatty acids, amino acids, vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants to maintain optimal skin and coat health. Nourishing ceramides maximize skin hydration by retaining moisture and forming a protective layer for a velvety soft coat. Formulated by nutritionists, Laser Sheen's proprietary blend delivers a show-stopping shine, supple skin, and healthy mane and tail growth. It contains a probiotic and is formulated in a palatable extruded nugget to support the digestion of nutrients. Whether you're at a show, on a trail, or riding at the barn, Laser Sheen Skin and Coat Supplement can help your horse make a lasting impression with a radiant coat and flowing mane and tail. Feed it year-round and watch your horse bloom. I'm Kim Brown, Group Publisher of the Equine Health Network. Dr. Chambers is a professor at the University of Kentucky's Gluck Equine Research Center, and he focuses on the study of infectious disease. He heads one of 3 global equine reference laboratories for equine influenza under the aegis of the World Organization for Animal Health. Dr. Chambers, who's been at the Gluck Center for nearly 32 years and who studied avian and human influenza viruses for 10 years before that, has been in the forefront of equine influenza vaccine research. Thank you, Dr. Chambers, for joining us today on EQUUS Farm Calls to talk about equine influenza.
Kim, thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, I've missed talking to you, so it's going to be fun today. And our listeners are in for a treat because this is somebody who really understands this and can tell us what's going on. So first, let's just get to the basics. What is equine influenza and why is it important to horse owners?
Equine influenza is very much like human influenza. It is caused by a virus, an influenza virus. It produces a respiratory illness with the signs that anyone will recognize. A cough, snotty nose. There's a fever. It is important to realize, just like with human beings, that the symptoms can be different from one horse to the next. This horse here might have a 106-degree fever, and the horse in the stall next door might not look sick at all. And that does not mean that it is not infected, that it's not shedding virus. In the natural order of things, this is one way that the virus survives, is by sometimes making its host not sick enough to do anything different. So in the case of a human, a person might think, I just have a little bit of snotty nose. I can still go to work. And next thing you know, there's 3 people at work coming down with the flu. So it's the same thing with horses. It's a disease caused by a virus that spreads very rapidly. In horses, it has always been one of the leading causes of infectious upper respiratory disease.
And horse owners, of course, we've all learned a lot from COVID-19 that respiratory viruses, they can change or drift, or there's a new strain that occurs, which is true of equine influenza too. So can you explain that to us just a little?
Part of the survival strategy of this virus, influenza is really a very simple virus, but it survives by having a very effective strategy, which is basically it's always changing its spots. It's always changing its appearance to the immune system. You can have a a perfectly good immunity to last year's strain or the strain from 5 years ago, but it doesn't work anymore against this year's strain because the virus has mutated just enough to keep the immune system off balance. So the same thing has happened with COVID. In fact, thinking about what I wanted to say today, I think the COVID emergency of the last 2 years really helps to reinforce some points that people should remember in connection with their horses as well as with their own personal health. And that is that these viruses do spread very easily. They're not necessarily fatal. Influenza in horses is seldom fatal, except in very young foals, neonatal foals. The vaccines exist. They're good vaccines, but they do not produce lifelong immunity because the virus has its strategy for keeping the immune system off balance.
Well, that's a very good explanation of how all this is going on. It helps me understand even COVID a little better. So as far as equine flu goes, what horses are most at risk for flu?
Any horse is potentially at risk, but the horses that travel, that go to events, that mingle with other horses that are not in its usual social group. Performing horses, for example, that go to race meets or event meets or sales, and suddenly they're thrown into contact with a large number of horses that come from all around the country. They've been shipped in. And the shipping process is kind of stressful for horses, and the stress can help some diseases take hold that if they were not stressed, maybe they would just throw it off. But here they are at a sales meet or an event, and there's 200 horses there, and maybe all 200 have been vaccinated, but some of them were vaccinated five months and 3 weeks ago. And so their immunity is starting to wear off. And so if flu happens to take hold in that horse, that provides a breeding ground to kind of amplify the risk to the other horses around it. So it is a disease that survives by spreading rapidly from low immunity animals to animals that if they were by themselves, standing in their paddock or with the same 5 horses that it sees every day of the year, then those horses would in that situation they would not be at risk. It spreads, and when you throw horses from different parts of the country together, then that is a place where spread becomes easy. It's like airport terminals for people.
Oh, that's always a scary one. How can a horse owner best protect a horse from equine influenza?
Well, as I said, there are good vaccines, and that's always the starting point. The vaccines are a lot better now than they were 30 years ago when I first came into this field. There are different kinds of vaccines, but all vaccines are designed to stimulate an immune response against the agent, in this case, against equine influenza. And the American Association for Equine Practitioners has guidelines for vaccination for horses. Those guidelines are reviewed periodically to keep them up to date. for equine influenza, this is what is called a risk-based vaccination guideline, meaning that, like I said, the horse that is just standing all alone in his paddock is a low-risk horse, and maybe once a year is sufficient vaccination for a low-risk horse. When you have the high-risk horse that is always traveling around, like I said, the airport terminal analogy, the more time it spends in airport terminals, the higher risk it is at. And so it should be vaccinated more frequently. And I would say 6 months really is in my view, it ought to be adequate, and sometimes it isn't quite adequate. And so maybe when a horse is getting to be 4 and 5 months out from its last flu vaccination and it's going to an event or a race meet, then the owner should really think seriously about getting it revaccinated instead of waiting until the 6 months have expired.
And what about management and biosecurity of the animal?
Well, that's another area that I think COVID has put fresh in people's minds, with mask wearing, social distancing. Well, those, of course, we don't put masks on horses, but social distancing is basically the equivalent of what we call isolation or quarantine. And so if a horse farm has horses coming onto the property from out of town, for example, those horses have potentially been exposed. The farm operator, the owner, should consider the safety of his resident animals against the possibility that these horses coming onto the farm might be bringing some disease with them, some disease like equine influenza or other diseases, herpes, for example. Basically an animal coming onto the farm really ought to be socially distanced until it has been cleared by for humans, for COVID, it was 2 weeks isolation. And I think 2 weeks isolation for new arrivals on the farm is also a good idea. So quarantine, we've been talking about quarantine for years, and now I think COVID has reinforced that quarantine is effective for people, and it would be effective for horses. Vaccination, of course, we've talked about, and vaccination protects the individual animal against a low level of exposure. One thing to remember is that for all these contagious diseases, there is what we call an infectious dose. And usually, not always, but usually the infectious dose is some large multiple of the minimum dose that can be detected by PCR. Now, we use PCR. Diagnostic labs use PCR to detect equine influenza in nasal swabs. And PCR is a valuable tool. A very weak PCR reading you have to wonder, is that really an infectious dose? But it is a warning sign, because what is a weak level today might be a much higher level tomorrow. If the horse has just got sick, it could be just starting to shed today and really shedding full blast tomorrow or the day after. So the vaccinated horse had probably more resistant to a low level of exposure than a non-vaccinated horse. A non-vaccinated horse that is let's say it's a weanling. It's had no prior exposure. Its dam had exposure, had been vaccinated, had maternal antibodies that had passed on to its foal. But those maternal antibodies aren't going to last forever. They may last 6 months at the most. By then, the foal has turned a weanling, and now its maternal antibodies have all decayed away, and it is now at risk. And so when it gets to be weanling age, it is time for the owner and the farm veterinarian to start planning on the vaccination schedule for that weanling. And I've forgotten what the initial question was now, but I hope I covered it.
No, it was, we were just talking about protecting horses. So that was all great. How horse owners should let their vet swab the horse and submit it to know what the horse has, because it can have more than one thing at a time. But tell us about those tests and what happens to it and why those are so important.
Well, there are actually three different levels of testing. The old-fashioned way, which we still do in my lab, was to try and isolate virus. And it's the least sensitive. We still do it because we want the isolates. We use those isolates to characterize the viruses that are in circulation today in comparison with the viruses that are in the vaccines. But like I said, isolation is the least sensitive. There are stall side tests, rapid influenza detection tests, which are kind of intermediate in sensitivity. Their big advantage is they are fast. They're simple. A veterinarian can do them, on their own and read out the result to the horse owner in 15 or 20 minutes time. Because they are intermediate in sensitivity, there is the danger of a false negative result, and we see that with the COVID testing too. The concern over false negative results. False positives are fairly rare, but false negatives are not rare, unfortunately. It all depends on the quality of the nasal swab sample. And so a poor job of nasal swabbing is liable to give a poor test result. And when you're dealing with a horse that does not like having a swab stuck up its nose, it is really easy to get a poor sample. The ideal sample is a nasopharyngeal swab, which means sticking the swab about 16 inches up the horse's nose. And the funny thing is, it's the first 3 inches that it objects to the most. And if you can get past there, the next foot isn't so bad. But sticking it 3 inches in or 16 inches in, the horse might fight you, the way that a horse can fight. They're bigger than you are. So all that is to say that a poor swab sample can give a poor test result, and that means that the PCR testing becomes more important because it is so sensitive. It is less affected by a poor swab sample. Okay, it could probably still detect virus even if the sample is not that good. Now, there are circumstances that always interfere. I pointed out one, which is the horse might fight you on it. Another is the way the sample is stored, how long it takes to get to the diagnostic lab. The PCR is not omniscient. It can't compensate for a sample that is taken 4 or 5 days to get to the diagnostic lab and then sitting on a loading dock in 90-degree heat for most of that time. The sample is probably going to be ruined. Ideally, the sample should be on ice from beginning to end and should take like overnight to get to the diagnostic lab. That is the ideal. And there are programs in place such as the Merck respiratory biosurveillance program that helps facilitate the sending swabs to a diagnostic lab prepared to receive them. The nasal swab, the original sample, is the weak link in diagnosis. Now, even going back a step earlier than that, recognizing that the horse is infected in the first place, that is not an automatic. I mean, sometimes, the horse could have had a fever for a day or two before the groom notices it's been off its feed. Maybe the cough does not develop for a day or two. It is I think valuable for the horse owners from the standpoint of the health of their horses, that their horses get monitored daily, and that if anything is a little bit off, then they get their temperature taken, and that at the first sign of disease that the vet gets called, and if it's respiratory, that a nasal swab gets taken at the first sign, and not 3 or 4 days later, which happens a lot.
Let's go back to your lab. I mean, you've been there for a long time. You've come up with a lot of cool stuff on viruses, especially equine influenza. So what's going on in your lab right now?
Right now, we have been intrigued by the outbreak that occurred almost worldwide at the end of 2018, 2019, an equine influenza outbreak, and that really was happening on 4 different continents. Western Europe and England probably had their biggest outbreak in over 10 years, but there were outbreaks also in South America, Africa, which we believe that was triggered by the importation of polo ponies from Argentina into Africa, Central Africa, and which again points out how easily this disease can spread. Africa is only 24 hours by plane from South America. It's a small world now, and it's a small world for viruses too. And in the United States, it was not a killer outbreak, but we did have elevated levels of equine flu in the United States. And in all these regions, there were cases where it appeared that vaccinated horses were still getting sick. They weren't getting as sick generally. So the vaccine still had some effect, but we were surprised really to see that there was this incidence of disease in horses that we would have expected to be protected. And so, when we started seeing that, our first thought was the virus has changed, which we know it does over time. And so we thought, okay, it's changed, and now the strains in the vaccines need to be updated to reflect what is circulating now instead of what was circulating when those vaccines were developed. We do these, like I said, we try to get virus isolates so that we can compare them by different tests. We could see subtle differences, but we weren't seeing the big differences that would indicate that the vaccine should not have been working. And, like I said, we run different tests, and our conventional test is to throw out some techno babble. It's called the hemagglutination inhibition test, and that was not showing the differences we thought we were going to see. So we're part of a worldwide network that does equine influenza surveillance. And at our meeting in 2019 and again in 2020, our network resorted to information coming out of the University of Cambridge that they use a technique called antigenic cartography, which is basically a way of assembling a lot of hemagglutination inhibition test results into a map that you can pretty simply interpret. So it's a big, for me, it's a big time saver because I'm not the one that has to do the computations. It's really computation intensive. They do the analysis in 5 dimensions and then reduce it down to 2 so that I can figure it out. Okay. And the antigenic cartography was not showing differences between the 2019 outbreak strains and the vaccine strains either. So we started, now all this is based on the hemagglutination inhibition test. And so we started thinking, is that test missing something? One thing that it could be missing is that the viruses were still, or pardon me, let me say, the antibodies that the vaccines were raising still inhibited hemagglutination, but they weren't inhibiting the virus growth. So that is called neutralization, that the antibodies are supposed to neutralize the virus, and maybe they weren't. So we applied a different test called the serum neutralization assay, which is a lot more labor intensive than hemagglutination inhibition. And so that's why it had never really been routinely done. But now we're going to start doing it more often. Our first results with the serum neutralization test, in fact, all our results with the serum neutralization test still don't see a difference between these new virus strains and the old ones. So we had another thought that we're looking at the virus gene called the hemagglutinin, but there's other virus genes, and one in particular called the neuraminidase is also believed to be important in the protection of horses from influenza. In other words, that antibodies against the neuraminidase might are involved in protection, and maybe the virus has changed the neuraminidase, not the hemagglutinin. So sorry for all the long words. We use our own shorthand, but I won't go into that. The neuraminidase, there's no simple test for comparing different virus strains by their neuraminidase. So we used a complicated test called an enzyme-linked lectin assay to compare how antibodies against the neuraminidase were reacting against these latest outbreak strains compared to the old ones. And still nothing. We still don't see any difference in the neuraminidase. And so we are still left to wonder why we were seeing vaccinated horses still get sick in that outbreak. Now, I will point out most vaccinated horses did not get sick. And so that is still reinforcing that the vaccines are mainly effective. And so why did some horses not be protected? Some vaccinated horses not be protected? We're, I think, starting to wonder about horse-to-horse variation in response to vaccination. And again, we have seen this in humans with COVID, that not everybody reacts to COVID vaccination the same way. And in some people, even if the initial antibody response is good, we see in some people it wears off faster than in other people. And so, we're falling back on that as our explanation for what we saw in the equine flu outbreaks 2 years ago. Now, the upshot is that all our tests not showing any deficit on the part of the vaccines, that there's not been a rationale to change the vaccines, because that's an expensive and time-consuming process for the vaccine manufacturers. And if we don't have a good rationale for them to do it, then why should they do it? As far as we could tell, the existing vaccines are still working. So it's taken us the last year or so of working in my laboratory and in others' laboratories to come to that conclusion. But that's where we stand as of today. Okay, now by 6 months from now, it could all change again. And influenza is a moving target, and so all our conclusions are only good for now. And that's going to be like COVID also, I think.
Yeah.
That my prediction is that an annual COVID booster is probably going to be in the works for humans, just like an annual flu booster.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, is there anything else, Dr. Chambers, that you would like to tell horse owners about equine influenza? You've covered a lot today, and I really appreciate it. I always learn something every time I talk to you.
I think I just want to reinforce the idea that horses that are traveling, that are exposed to other horses, that is a great way to pick up a variety of diseases, not just influenza, although influenza is a leading one, and that horse owners should be cognizant of the fact that they could, when they bring their horses back to the farm, that they could be bringing back something that they don't want, that their horse is carrying. And so reinforce isolation, social distancing for a period of time until they're sure their returning horse really is healthy.
Well, those are some good tips. Well, we really appreciate you joining us today, Dr. Chambers, for the EQUUS Farm Calls podcast. And a big thanks to our audience for joining us today. And Dr. Chambers wants one more thing.
And one more thing just occurred to me to mention to horse owners. Influenza is easy to kill. Soap, detergents, Lysol, all those things will kill it. And so, being liberal in washing your hands and disinfecting your equipment. Okay, thank you.
No, that's a perfect ending, because they're owners. There's something we all can do, and I'm probably not as good as others, but let's make sure and not share our equipment, or if we do, let's make sure we're getting it clean in between horses. So good point, Dr. Chambers. Thank you again for joining us today. Thanks to our audience for joining us, and I welcome any input that you have for the podcast and hope you'll tell your friends about it. And if you have any suggestions or comments, feel free to contact me at kbrown, that's the letter K Brown, at equinenetwork.com. EQUUS Farm Calls is a production of the Equine Podcast Network, an entity of the Equine Network, LLC.